So today we will talk about Japan and some of the changing developments in Japan. We'll talk about the Tokugawa shogunate. If you remember what a shogunate is, a shogun is the word for a general. So this is the form of government which they have, which is actually a military, sort of military form of government, controlled by general and sort of, this controlled Japan for hundreds of years, actually, almost 300 years. They were under the shogunate of Tokugawa. Japan is also very much isolated, self-imposed, I guess, isolation. Japan had been isolated really almost throughout its history. Very rarely had it not been isolated. But this was on purpose. They did not want to be influenced by the outside, and they did not want to have contact with the outside. But remember, we talked about before what I call the 3 M's, right? Merchants, missionaries, and then the military. These are often come in this order. But during this period, merchants had been basically driven out. Missionaries had been driven out. And really the only sort of relations or trade, direct trade that Japan had was with Korea. Now there was very, very limited trade with the West, and that came with the Dutch and also China. But this was limited to one island in one harbor of one city. It was an island in the harbor of Nagasaki that was designated a trade island. So the Dutch would sail their ship to this island, which is in the harbor, leave off their goods, pick up goods, and sail away. So this is about as limited as you can get to still have some outside contact. The Chinese did the same. Now, of course, Japan had a centralized power. They had been, if you remember, the last time we talked about Japan, at any rate, they had been unified through force, and they had a new capital. Their capital was in a town called Edo, which today we call Tokyo. So the government had been moved to Edo. The Bakufu, or the tent government, this is the tent government of the sort of military government of the shogunate. So basically the idea was, much like generals would meet in their tents before the battle, the government would meet in tents, not literally in tents, but that kind of style, where you bring the leaders in, they kind of discuss, and then they make a decision. They got one made general who has the final decision. So this is the Tokugawa shogunate. Now the other thing you have to remember is that under this period there is a very strong, what we might call in Europe, nobility. So if you know anything about medieval Europe, you could apply some of that idea to Japan. They're not identical, but they're similar. There is a nobility called the daimyo. These are the sort of upper class, the people that kind of run things, and they're under the rule of the shogun, or the general, who oversees this, and he has a nobility or upper class that works within society as well. So during this time, towns were increasing and growing, and manufacturing was beginning to pick up as well. And as that happens, and much like you see in Europe, as things begin to grow, some of the old distinctions begin to get worn. class distinctions, class separation, because of the new sort of economy that's developing. So some of the medieval distinctions get blurred. What used to be very simple, we've got the upper crust, we've got the peasants, we've got the military. Of course, we will speak of the samurai, which are the warriors of the nobility. But problems are beginning to grow. And what are those problems? Well, it shouldn't surprise us, since last time we were talking about China, and the problem that China had was, of course, with the West. So Japan, very much wanting to be isolated. The West very much wants to get in on the market here. Okay? So this is what's going to happen. Well, how does this actually come to a turning point, I guess we'll call it? How's that? Well, it happens with the United States, actually. The United States is getting more involved in this part of the world, primarily through the Spanish-American War. But we're also sailing in this area, the Pacific. We're getting more islands in the Pacific. We're wanting places where we can get supplies. Japan would be a good place to do that for trade, for supplies. And so probably your favorite president of all time, Millard Fillmore. We just celebrated his day just on Monday. I like to think of it as Millard Fillmore Day instead of President's Day, because he was president. Well, the United States tries to establish a relationship here and fails. This is in the 1830s and the 1840s. But the U.S. needs a place in this part of the world to refuel their ships, to resupply their ships. So in the middle of the 19th century, this will bring all of this to a focal point, right? Under the leadership of a guy by the name of Commodore Perry. Matthew Perry. You probably know him best from his role on Friends as Chandler. No? You never saw the Friends. Don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. Well, it's a TV show. Some people have watched it. There's a guy on there who just he just couldn't be. Could you be any lamer to not watch Friends? See, stuff like that. That's sort of something he would say. Joey. Joey's another guy that's on the show. But you haven't seen the show, so you don't know what I'm talking about. They were friends. Theoretically, I don't think they really were friends. I think they were just acquaintances, but that was me. That wouldn't be a good name for a show, Acquaintances.
Sounds like a parody of Friends.
Well, anyway, Commodore Perry, Matthew Perry, shows up with 4 warships in Edo Bay. And he says, I got a letter here from my president, Millard Fillmore. And he's saying that, we really should think about having a trade and partnership and refueling and restocking of supplies of my 4 warships. And by the way, we got a few more warships we might bring over as well if you are interested, all right? So basically, this is what's sometimes called gunboat diplomacy. This is usually the kind of diplomacy that I receive. I don't have a choice. Yes, you're going to do that. Oh, I am? Yes, you are. Okay, I am. See, there we go. So you had a letter from our president, Millard Fillmore. There's his picture. Anybody here go to Millard Fillmore High School? Millard Fillmore Elementary, Millard Fillmore Middle School, Millard Fillmore Academy of Greater Learning? No? Nothing. Maybe we should start naming something after Miller. He needs a name for something. After all, he was a president. Haven't had that many of them. So, as I said, we call it sometimes gunboat diplomacy. Put it right up there. And there's our buddy, Commodore Matthew Perry.
Looks like he's about to sneeze.
Well, that's because of Joey and Ross dumped the pepper in the kitchen while they were playing foosball. But don't worry, Rachel is going to help them. No, you don't know who any of these people are. That's all right. I thought the show was popular, but evidently nobody's seen it. Well, one of the things that they are worried about is better treatment of sailors who have been shipwrecked. One of the things the Japanese would do, if, for example, let's say a U.S. ship or any ship that was not Japanese happened to wreck, capsize, come aground on Japanese island, instead of sort of helping those guys out, repair their ship, get them back on their way, they would throw them in prison. So news of this kind of gets out that this was a Japanese MO, modus operandi. And so they wanted to put an end to that. So he says, okay, we want a better relationship with you and we want better treatment if any of our sailors get shipwrecked. And by the way, I'll be back with my gunboats for your answer in a few days. When the gunboats show up again, the Japanese decide to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1853. The U.S. Consul Townsend Harris in 1858 expanded the treaty, and this is sometimes called the Harris Treaty. And so with these two documents then, Japan is opened up to the United States for trade. And of course, once everybody else finds out, you know how they are. They all want to get in on the action. The British, the French, so forth. So Commodore Matthew Perry. Commodore Matthew Perry. You didn't know he was a sailor, did you? What was his job? I don't think he had one, did he? He did something. You know, if you go to what I call Hollywood, which is out there in California, you can take a little tour of a studio out there, and they've got the set from that show. I actually sat on the set. You know, they go to a coffee shop in the show. You've never seen the show, so you know what I'm talking about. They go to a coffee shop often, and they just sit around not doing anything, just kind of talking, theoretically drinking coffee. I don't think it really was coffee. But you can sit on that couch. I sat on that couch. I sat on the, well, if you're looking at it, I was on the right side. You know. So I recommend, it's a good tour. Warner Brothers Studios. I'd recommend it to you. I get no money for this endorsement. I get no compensation of any kind. Even if I go back, they won't let me in for free. Even though I'm telling you to go, they don't care. They figure my endorsement probably actually hurts them more than it helps them. Well, now the ports are open to the US of A. And of course, like I said, the Europeans want to get in on it. So the Europeans sign similar agreements along with their veiled threats to persuade the signatures, just as I guess you might say the U.S. had done, gunboat diplomacy. There is one area called Satsuma and Chosu. These regions of Japan resist this. They don't like this idea that, you know, Japan is being opened up to the Western influence and that these guys are pushing their way in. So they carry out what I call Johnny Depp activity, pirating of the Western ships. And it's sometimes called the Sacho Alliance. So this is kind of a resistance to this activity. But eventually, all of this turmoil and trouble and changes weaken the shogunate, which, if you remember our dates there, falls in 1868, bringing an end to almost 300 years of this dynasty or rule. So what's going to rule? What's it going to be next? It's called the Meiji rule. They get a new emperor. And take a look at this drawing, this painting. These are Japanese people, but they don't look like they're dressed like they're Japanese to me. They look like they're dressed like they're Europeans or maybe Americans. The ladies are wearing Western style dresses and hats, bonnets, or whatever you want to call it. The guys are wearing fairly Western style military uniforms, with banner, like little sashes and brass buttons and whatever. They're looking pretty European. And so this is really what the Meiji rule is about. So that's why I put this picture here to kind of remind you that what they're going to try to do is sort of Westernize. They want to remain Japanese at their heart, but they realize that the West are powerful, and they want to try to become more powerful themselves. So Meiji means enlightened rule. Now the Sacho still doesn't trust the West, even with these changes. But they realize that Japan must change. And so the imperial court takes over the shogunate. The palace in Edo, in the capital city, but they rename it to now call the city not Edo, but Tokyo. And Tokyo means Eastern capital. This was their way of basically saying this is when Japan made a concerted effort to become an imperialistic power themselves. Not a Western power, but like the capital here, an Eastern power, Eastern capital of the Eastern Empire of Japan. And so now they will begin, and they will fairly rapidly expand their holdings into Pacific, in Southeast Asia, and so forth, until, of course, Japan becomes quite powerful. As you might remember, there was a war called WW2, right? World War II. If there's a World War II, that means there had to be a World War I. But World War II, of course, pitted the United States against Japan. We pretty much had to do it all by ourselves. And we had a little bit of help from the Australians, I guess, and maybe a few others. But mostly, we had to take them on. And that was formidable fight, because they had a lot of territory and a lot of resources. Well, what are they going to do? How are they going to make Japan from this medieval shogunate into a Western, sort of Western-style imperialistic nation? Well, they had a plan. One plan was they had to get rid of the old ways. Get rid of the feudalism. Remember, we talked about feudalism. That's the control of land for exchange of oaths of loyalty. There's a lot of tradition there. There's a lot of oaths. There's a lot of loyalty. They wanted to get rid of all of that. Get rid of the feudalism. Get rid of the hereditary privileges that the nobility would have, or the daimyo would have. And they do all that by 1871. They also know to get rid of this, they must get rid of the samurai. The samurai are the symbol of this way of life. They're the backbone of this way of life, actually. And so the samurai are forced to give up wearing their sword. This is, well, it's hard to explain how difficult this would be for a samurai. How upsetting it would be to many that the samurai had been reduced to being non-warriors, to not be able to wear the, because they were the premier warriors. They were the ones who had been the backbone of the military, backbone of all these things. Well, they're forced to change, and of course many of them are reluctant to change, and they are punished for it. If you want to see a film, it's a pretty good film, I guess. It's called The Last Samurai. Anybody seen that? The Last Samurai. It's got a very tall guy in it. His name is Tom Cruise. I think he's about 5'2". He's in there as the last samurai. So in that film, for the first time in ages, Tom Cruise doesn't have to stand on a box while he delivers his lines, because that's just a joke. I'm sure Tom Cruise is very tall. Anyway, this is called the 1868 Charter Oath. And a lot of these things are happening now. Get rid of the nobility, get rid of the samurai. And basically that movie about the last samurai is talking about how a general, or well, I don't know if he's a general, colonel or something from the American Civil War gets hired by the Japanese to come over and help to modernize their military. And this is when he encounters the samurai. And he gains a, well, I don't have a spoiler alert for you. I'm not going to tell you that he's really dead the whole time throughout the movie and it's all a dream. I'm not going to tell you that because I don't want to spoil the movie for you. You might want to watch it sometime, though. I think you might find it interesting. It is about this period that we're talking. So in 1868, they have a charter oath. There are advisory councils dominated by the Sacho. And we see this changes rapidly implemented, from the 1860s, 1870s. And we're going to see rapidly over the next 20 to 30 years, Japan will become a real powerhouse. Well, the politics of Japan are dominated by the Genro. The Genro are the elder statesmen. The elder statesmen. So kind of the politicians of their day. They decide they need to reorganize Japan to make it more amenable to modernization, I guess you might say. So they end up dividing up Japan into 75 prefectures, 75 regions, or I guess we could call it states, but they're not as big as our states, obviously. Counties, I don't know. 75 prefectures. Now Japan, by the way, has 47. They've reduced the number. And what happens? They study Western political systems. And what develops are political parties. Three dominant parties: a liberal party. The Liberal Party wants a very Western, democratic government with a parliament. Maybe something like the British have, House of Lords, House of Commons, that kind of thing. Anyway, so that's one option. But there are two other options. One of them will win out. Which one will it be? We'll find out. I don't want to tell you Tom Cruise was dead in the entire movie, and then at the end you figure it out. Actually, he was the reincarnation of the samurai. And in fact, he was the last samurai who was reincarnated as an American soldier. I think I got a pretty good movie going here. I think I'm going to redo that movie. That might actually make it more interesting. Anyway, there was the Progressive Party, and they wanted a government more, instead of like, say, the British, more like the Germans. where you had an emperor, a Kaiser, and then you had a political party that way. And then, of course, there was the third, and that's the imperial party that just wanted all the power with the emperor. Okay? So one was very democratic, one was very much imperial, and then there's kind of the one in the middle, this progressive party. The progressive party, spoiler alert, they're the ones who went out. And so about 1880, the government in Japan changes. And by 1890, there's the Meiji Constitution. Power focused on the executive branch of the government. Okay? So, this is where they find themselves. It's kind of a takeover from the top down. In other words, they kind of decide they need to restructure Japan, and so they restructure it, not a sort of revolution from the bottom up, but a kind of revolution from the top down, if you want to call that, or a restructuring from the top down. With one goal: make Japan more powerful, use the ideas from the West, but still try to keep your center, your soul, whatever you want to call it, in the East, as Japanese. So we're going to be Japanese in our inner, but we'll be looking Western on the outer. Well, there you have it. Now for this, the upper house is appointed. The lower house, the Diet, was elected. Okay, so kind of a compromise on the representative bodies. There also must be a real focus on industrialization. Remember, the Industrial Revolution really began in England, began in earnest around 1800. So the Japanese here are, 70, 80 years behind for the most part. But they want to try to catch up as fast as they can. And so they begin to build railroads. They begin to build more industrialized sort of factories and shipbuilding. They want to build the latest sort of metal ships with steam engines and that sort of thing. The government is highly involved in all this, driving the industry, sort of controlling what the businesses do for their goal. Their goal is to make Japan an industrial powerhouse as soon as possible, and a military powerhouse as well. So the main industries at this time are tea, you might expect that, silk, weaponry, shipbuilding, and of course, sake. Now you have no idea what that is. It's not SEU approved, so I even hesitate to mention it. But sake is an alcoholic beverage made from rice. Rice wine, sometimes it's called. So this is what they're manufacturing. But one of the things they're kind of short on here for an industrial revolution are things like metal, iron, stuff like that. They don't have enough, so they're going to need those items. Other changes that they bring about. What are these other changes? They want to create a modern army. They want to modernize their military. And of course, that means getting rid of the samurai, as we've already mentioned. In that movie, there's a scene where the samurai decide to go to fight against the modern army, right? I guess that's towards the end of the film, maybe. So spoiler alert, Tom Cruise is dead the whole time. So don't believe anything he says. Anyway, you'll have to watch it. I don't want to wreck it for you, but that is a big scene at the end. You might even find yourself sympathetic to the samurai. These guys who would like to slice your head off with a razor-sharp sword. No, they're nice guys. They're just misunderstood. The samurai. Might be a few samurai in here. I don't know. Some of you kind of look like a samurai. And in 1871, here's what everybody likes. Universal conscription. What do we mean by that? What does it mean to have conscription, and especially if it's universal?
Take anyone in your army?
Into the army, yes, yes. Well, yeah, we can't call it, sometimes people call it the draft. It's not the draft. The draft is a lottery a lot of people don't want to win. Because a draft, by its very nature, is not taking everybody. It's selective service. Perhaps you've had to register for that. What do they call it? U.S. Selective Service, right? That's basically the draft. That would mean that in times that they would need people, they would say, okay, we need so many people. They have all the names in the hopper. Whoop, they pull out some names. You're the lucky winner. You get a career in the military for a while. Okay? But this is not that kind of thing. This is universal. Everybody has to be in the military. Right? Well, men, not the ladies. Universal in that it's all men, but not all people. What I've been waiting for, and I've been waiting for a long time, about 40 years, 50 years, I've been waiting for the protests from the ladies that they are excluded from selective service. That's discriminatory. Why are the ladies discriminated against and not have to sign up for the selective service? Only the men. And you have to sign up. I mean, if you want a student loan, if you want to, get your taxes back, there's a lot of pressure to sign up. You really have to sign up. You could get in a lot of trouble if you don't sign up. But the ladies don't. Why do they exclude them? It's terrible. I'm waiting for Elizabeth Warren or some of these other candidates to make it in their platform. We will make the selective service non-gender bias, inclusive. Well, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. But it is something I've noticed. There's a lot of protests, but none about that one. At least I haven't heard of any yet. Maybe they'll be coming up. It is an election year. We could bring it up. That'll be great to give you a lot of votes. A lot of ladies will vote for that one if you run it. Maybe Joe Biden should say he was going to do that, and he'd get more votes. Well, anyway, so when I say universal conscription, it's really not universal, right? That's what I'm trying to point out. It's just the guys. But it means that every man, every male must be in the military. You're just in. They have this in certain countries today. Especially, by the way, in Israel, both men and women must serve in the military. See how progressive they are? What we can learn from them. Well, anyway, let's move on. They revamp their schools and they give their schools an American model. With semesters and courses and that sort of thing. There are other systems of education besides the ones we have. Perhaps this is not a good time to bring that up given this setting. But even say at universities in England have university things that are much different than ours. For example, some people say that, well, all college should be free. That's what they do over in Europe. True, but here's the thing. College is free, but it's not for everyone. we basically encourage everybody to go to college. In Europe, they discourage most people from going to college because they have these mandatory tests that you must take, and you have to get a certain level in them or you can't go to college. Okay? Something to keep in mind. Plus, their system is they would not have anything like this where we have a class. It's called World History. It's 15 weeks. You come twice a week. You come 30 times. You take certain tests. You do certain assignments, and then you're done with it. And then you move on next semester. You never have to think about history again the rest of your life. That's not the way they do things. There, you would just decide if you would want to come to one of these invigorating lectures that I might give. And then at the end of your time here, whenever you think you're ready, after say 3 years, 4 years, you go and sit and take exams. And if you pass those series of exams, then you get your degree. If you don't get your degree. That's their style. Very different than our style. Our style is piecemeal. You do a little piece of it here, a little piece of it there, this semester, that semester, this semester, and then you're done. Theirs is more you get all this sort of experience, education, reading, whatever. You get tutoring. You can go to lectures and stuff like that. And then when you're ready, you sit down and you take a big test. You either pass it or you don't. That's their system. I digress, as I often do. Let's move on. They do progress quickly. They become more and more westernized, you might say, or industrialized, imperialistic. They adopt imperialism. They are not shy about it. This is what they are intending to do. Because remember, they are a small territory, relatively speaking. Japan is not large. It's a series of islands. Much of the islands are mountainous. They're not good for agriculture. They have limited resources for what you might need for industrialization. So they're going to have to go out and find those things that they need. So they'll be looking for it. Things like rubber and coal and iron and later on oil, right? They don't have any of those things. Or very, very little. So they have to go and get them. And so they can find a lot of that in Asia. The United States, by the way, becomes a trade partner with them, selling them a lot of iron so they can make steel to make their ships and so forth. This is part of what leads to the altercation at Pearl Harbor. The United States said we're no longer going to trade these items with you because of the fear of what the Japanese perhaps might do. Well, anyway. Expansion. Here's one expansion. See, what happens is when you're in an expansion mood or mode, you start to look for ways that you might expand. One of these happens in 1874. The Japanese are ready to expand. An event happens. There are Japanese sailors from Ryukyu and Taiwan. There's an altercation, and in Taiwan, some of them are killed. This is a provocation, and so the Japanese send their warships to punish Taiwan. At any rate, they take over the Ryukyu Islands as a result. In 1876, Japan gets access to 3 Korean ports. By 1880, there's tension with Japan and between Japan and China over Korea. In other words, the Japanese want to control the Korean peninsula, and the Chinese had controlled or had great influence and controlled directly or indirectly the Korean peninsula for many years. But remember what we just talked about. China is in decline. Japan is on the rise. And so in 1894 and 1895, there is the Sino-Japanese War. Sino means China. So between China and Japan, they fight a war. And Japan wins. I'll leave that up there. Might want a little more time with that. By the way, here's a picture of Admiral Sago Tusamichi. Easy for me to say. He was the one sent to punish Taiwan for killing those sailors from Ryukyu. And so we see an aggressive stance on the side of the Japanese, an imperialistic stance. They're sort of looking for excuses or reasons to move into areas, take control, flex their muscles, so to speak, militarily, and expand their territory. And they really are very interested in that. And they will expand their territory a great amount from, let's say, the 1880s, 1875 to 1935, 39. You know, they more than double their land holdings. Well, here you go. Here are those Ryukyu Islands. You see them just to the south of Japan. So these have kind of been disputed. They're in between Taiwan and Japan. And so by 1872, the Japanese have taken control of that area. They will eventually then take over Taiwan, which they will name Formosa, and a port on the mainland in 1895. They're going to fight a war with Russia. Now, this is what gets a lot of people's attention because, you know, well, China, they're kind of weak, Taiwan, you know, but Russia, I mean, is a Western power, but they have holdings all the way over here. You can see Russia, you know, just right up here, and then these areas out here in these islands and peninsulas out here. They defeat the Russians. They annex first the Kuril Islands in 1875. See, they get those in 1875, these in 1872. You get this in 1895. They take over Korea Peninsula. They take over south part of Manchuria. They take over the Shandong Peninsula. And they keep moving southward. The Treaty of Shimonoseki. No, close maybe. This treaty is basically one that's going to bring Korea under their, you know, Korea is independent, but Japan is eyeing it. Taiwan will come under the control of Japan. The growing tensions between Japan and Russia will lead to a war in 1904. The Japanese attack Russia over these islands to the north. This is called the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. Notice these wars don't last long. They're quick wars. And it's a quick victory for the Japanese. They're just winning, you know, gaining. They're a growing power. This is now, especially this one, the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, this has been catching the attention of the Europeans, but now they defeat the Russians. This makes the British nervous, the United States nervous, the French, and everybody is nervous about this. Remember, we said that it was in the 1890s when we had a Spanish-American War. What was it, 1898? And we liberate, you might say, the Philippines from Spanish control. And then it's a struggle. What do we do with the Philippines? Do we just make them independent? They'll be very weak, and it was believed that the Japanese would come and take over the Philippines very rapidly if we did that. So the United States actually made the Philippines a kind of protectorate of the United States, in large measure to counter what the Japanese were doing. And then we actually made a deal with them later on. If the Japanese would recognize our control of the Philippines, we would recognize their control of Korean Peninsula. They annexed Korea in 1908. So see this steady progression, steady expansion. Islands to the north, islands to the south, coastal areas, peninsulas, and so forth. All of this brings them more land, but also more resources. More harbors, more ports, more trade, more taxes, more money. So the Japanese have learned from the Europeans. They have learned from them. And they're pretty quick learners, it appears. They have turned things around. They only started this in what, the 1870s? It's now 1908. Not even 40 years, 35 years. They have turned things around economically, industrially, militarily, and they are now expanding their territory. They're going to be, and they want to be, the power in the East. You know what the flag of Japan is, right? A red disc on a white background. That's supposed to be the sun rising over the east. And Japan, of course, is that sun that's going to shine out on Asia and control it. That was really what that was their goal. And they're going to continue this beyond what we're going to talk about today. In 1908, still in World War I and certainly in World War II, we see they continue to expand their control. Well, the United States and Japan, we mentioned this before. You can see a map here with Japan to the north, Philippines to the south, and of course the Korean Peninsula. So we've got our three blue, red, and green, kind of an obnoxious green, encircling the Korean Peninsula. Well, this is what I mentioned before. The United States had, of course, taken control of the Philippines. That puts us solidly into this sphere of influence, right? Philippines, pretty large chain of islands, and it's definitely in the South Pacific. Like I said, there was much discussion about if the Philippines were left to be independent, they would be very weak and would probably very quickly fall to the Japanese. So the U.S. gets involved. Now, one of the deals that they work out that I think some thought would bring some semblance of stability. We're not at war, but I mean, kind of hold off conflict. I think many people felt there was going to be a conflict with the Japanese. It was a matter of when, not if. Maybe not everyone agreed. But one of the deals they worked out was the U.S. would recognize Japan's control of the Korean Peninsula if the Japanese recognized U.S. control of the Philippines. So this was thought to be a compromise. and perhaps something that would sustain stability and peace in the region. But it's quite clear that there are growing tensions between the United States and Japan. The British were pretty far afield from this. You know, down in Australia, perhaps, over in India, they had other things they were concerned about. Some in the United States called it the yellow peril. Probably wouldn't get away with using that kind of terminology today. But we see, we've looked at China and we've looked at Japan, and we see that China and Japan both have to deal with a lot of the same dynamics, right? Rising European power. They are economically behind the times, industrially behind. How can they compete with England, the United States, and so forth? Japan's model works better, depending on how you count better. I mean, if you're Japanese, it works a lot better for them for a much longer. The Chinese, as we've already said, basically end up almost disintegrating, become very, very weak, when at the same time the Japanese are growing and they're becoming quite strong. This is going to make them a threat, make them a challenge, not only in this part of the world, but as we're going to see later on, of course, for the United States, the Pacific becomes increasingly important to us. And by the way, the Pacific has never been more important to us as it is right now. Our foreign policy, our diplomacy, our military, everything is shifting away from Europe and the Middle East and is shifting towards Asia, China, India, Southeast Asia. So I think it's going to increase. This has made a lot of people in Europe and the Middle East a little uncomfortable that the United States is withdrawing, diminishing their interest. Another reason why is that we have new sources of energy in the United States now. Natural gas, fracking. This has made the United States energy independent of the Middle East, so we no longer have such a vested interest in what goes on there. We've got our own supplies of energy. And we've got a much bigger threat, most people would say. The bigger threat's coming from China. It's the second largest economy in the world. We are the first. But we are indebted to them. We're losing money every day to China. So this is why there's a focus on it. And my guess would be we're going to move our military more that way, our foreign policy more that way, our focus. This is why actually I think I told you this before, I've been saying for at least 25 years, probably more than that. Let's say 25 years, that people should be learning Chinese. I still say it. Nobody ever listens. They used to really laugh when I said that. Now people aren't laughing quite as much. Now they kind of say, yeah, maybe I should, but that's a tough language, right? Maybe it's too late. All right, teach your children Chinese. If you can't learn it, I think you can learn it, but it was not going to hurt you to learn Mandarin Chinese or something like that. That would definitely help you out in your life over the next however many years you got, 40, 50, 60. Maybe you guys got 100 years left. All right. You got your average lifespan will go up to 120 or something. So you're going to need a lot of money to survive that long. Oh, you don't think so? We're all going to die early. He's shaking his head. Yeah, okay. He's going, yeah, we're dying early. Well, you know, one thing about dying early, you don't have to pay so many bills. As you get older and you think, I'm going to live to be 90, and you think, how am I getting enough money to live to be 90? What's that? Well, that's grim. Life can be grim. Do you still have that McDonald's guy called the Grimace? Probably don't have that anymore. Used to have the commercials, had the guy that was like the giant, I don't know what he was, like a purple, fuzzy creature. They called him the Grimace. Yeah. Hamburglar? They don't have the Hamburglar either, do they? You don't know any of those guys.
Oh, we don't. I remember. Yeah, they're just not around anymore.
Well, they should be. That's why McDonald's is going down the tubes. They got rid of the Grimace and the Hamburglar. People love that stuff. All right, you got any questions for me? Look at this. I'm going to let you go early today. Don't say I never did.